So what are we on about this time, Ant?
Well, this episode, I want to answer some listener questions about our previous episode when we talked about venture capital, specifically questions about BlackRock and how can it be that venture capitalists aren't indeed evil.
Well, we'll see about that, I guess. I want to talk, Ant, about the death of a cultural institution, something that we all used 35 years ago, America Online Dial-Up Service. Can you believe it's gone?
It's about time.
It was probably about time 20 years ago. But anyway, after that, we're going to get into the different kinds of economies. This is something you've been on about for a long time, and I'm kind of following behind. So really, what are you talking about here?
I want to tap into my social scientist side of being an economist and talk about how humans have evolved, and as they have evolved, the economies have evolved with them from agrarian to industrial to the data economy. And the question is, what's coming next? And I think AI gives us some examples.
You're going to talk about Star Trek again, aren't you?
It's where we're headed, James.
It's always where we're headed. If that doesn't scare you off, Words and Numbers is a CiVL original podcast. You can find out more at CiVL.com. That's CiVL.com.
Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
What's new and exciting in your world this week, Ant?
This week, I want to read an email from one of our listeners, Dr. Casey Whitener, who's commenting on our episode 443 about private equity. She says, how did y'all get through the entire episode without mentioning BlackRock? Recently, our South Carolina Hotel Association held a session with a bunch of academics looking at the problem of short-term rentals and found the private equity firms had been skirting hotel taxes and regulations by acting like Airbnbs and buying up properties in Myrtle Beach. Private equity in many places are like cockroaches of venture capital. That's a good phrase. She goes on. She says, I know quite a few businesses that relied on private equity to get up and going, but nearly all the founders I know regret taking the money because they lost control of their businesses to people who had little or no interest in the mission of the business, only in its scalability. And Katie raised some really interesting points here, which, going to her first about skirting the law and acting like Airbnbs, I don't want to make little of arguments like this. However, my first reaction is, this is not a market problem. This is, again, a government problem. That you've got some regulations in place and perhaps they're poorly written or poorly enforced or whatever it is. And because of that, BlackRock's going around it's not BlackRock, it's private equity firms going around the skirting the laws and doing whatever it is that they do. My first reaction is to write that off as a government failure rather than a market failure. Now, I looked a little bit into BlackRock, and I'll leave a link in the show notes. BlackRock is...
No, you won't. We don't leave links in the show notes anymore, Ant.
I will not leave a link in the show notes, but you can Google it. And I ran across this site, blackrocksbigproblem.com, says BlackRock is the world's largest asset management firm, currently managing about $9 trillion. Every year, BlackRock and other investors pour billions of dollars into companies that are destroying our climate. Now, right off there, I'm going to say that's open and shut a government failure. One of the roles of government, proper roles of government in society, is in protecting people from their property rights being violated, and where property rights don't exist, to help in the establishment and enforcement of property rights. And
Go
ahead.
Let me ask an obvious question here. Are we certain that that's happening, or is that the assertion of somebody writing for a website?
No, I don't know what's going on, other than I've got two pieces of information. Dr. Whitener mentioned BlackRock and this site, and I found actually a number of other sites that said BlackRock is investing in things that are destroying the environment. But this comes back in my mind to a government failure. The role of government is to protect property rights. And if you've got somebody destroying the environment, this is a violation of property rights. Or even worse, it's a situation where the property rights weren't even defined at all. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not throwing off all moral responsibility to government and saying, look, if businesses behave badly, this is just the government's fault. Businesses should not behave badly. They're run by human beings, and the human beings have certain moral obligations, and those things should always come to the fore. However, government is where the buck stops when it comes to things like definitions of and enforcement of property rights.
Yeah, I don't really know where to begin with this entire thing, right? Because if people are aggravated that their businesses are no longer mission-driven after private equity gets involved, then they shouldn't have gotten private equity involved.
Right.
But what they will also tell you is that they needed money in order to scale up their businesses, right? Which means that some form of private equity had to be involved.
Right. And more than that, who do they go to? People who are experts in scaling up businesses.
That's right. And when an investor comes to your business, that investor's only goal is to make more money. And that should be unremarkable. That is not a remarkable assertion that I've just made. So I don't know what to tell you except that businesses require investment. Investment has certain goals, and these things may, in the end, be antithetical to the goals of the founder that started a business to do X, whatever X may be.
Yeah, and I think you're right. When it comes to the investors, I think that's something markets are going to sort out, unlike the environment thing, which I'm going to throw squarely in the government's court. When it comes to private equity, perhaps taking over business, I shouldn't say taking over, because the private equity, the investors put up the money, and the people who own the business are willingly taking that money and handing over control to the investors. And if the business owners, the founders, don't like what's going on, then there's going to be a pushback over time against this type of investment. It's going to become harder and harder for these companies to invest.
Over time. And I think, just to give a quick example, you're seeing some pushback now over Airbnb, right? Where Airbnb was largely seen to be the savior against hotel chains, the same way that Uber was the savior against cab companies. But it turns out they got a little too greedy. They started charging a little too much. The charges were a bit too surprising at the end.
Right.
And now people are starting to say things like, well, it's actually easier just to stay in a hotel.
Yeah. Or I told you recently I was in New York City and was amazed that it was easier to get a cab and to pay the cab than it was to do the Uber, which was just eye-opening for me. And this is the way competition works. Somebody comes along with a better idea, and the existing people either trump that with something better still, or they go out of business.
And in both of these examples, I think the big problem, if it's to be seen as a problem, is that the competition doesn't change things overnight. It takes a while,
Yes.
right? Let's remember that we've had Uber for a couple of decades now, and the New York cabs are just starting to catch on. We've had Airbnb for a couple of decades now, and people are just starting to get tired of it. So it's going to take a minute. It happens, right? The competition happens, but it doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen overnight because you're dealing with entrenched industries who don't think they have to compete. They have to learn that they have to compete, and then they have to figure out how to compete. And those two things each take a while.
And to anyone who would say, well, this just takes too long, we should have regulation. No, the regulation, not only does it take longer, but if it's done incorrectly, it's going to take longer still to back it up.
Yeah, it takes too long now. Regulation is forever. Anyway, I want to talk about something that's almost kind of related to this, something that 35 years ago, Ant, we all took for granted. And I'm guessing you were never part of this movement, but I was briefly until I found a better option. And a lot of people fit into my category. A lot more fit into the long-term user category. America Online will cease operations in dial-up at the end of September.
I saw that, and what amazed me was not that they're ceasing it, but that they're still doing it.
That they hadn't already ceased a long time ago.
Right.
And for the younger people who are listening, you won't remember this, but you couldn't do anything in the space of an average day without coming into contact with about 150 AOL disks that were laying all over the horizon for you to just pick up and use. Every box of cereal you bought, every movie you went to, people were just handing these things out left and right. As a result, almost everyone's first internet experience was America Online.
Mm-hmm.
They made it easy. You put in the disk, you pressed a button, and magically it worked. You didn't have to configure things, right? You didn't have to endlessly tinker around with things. And, until dial-up, until broadband got like that, people didn't really know what to do with it, right? People want to screw around with their internet service for hours and hours and hours just to get it up and running. And that was an insight that AOL brought to the table early on. And they absolutely dominated the industry.
They did. I'd forgotten until you mentioned it. The discs, they were constantly sending the discs. You had to put the disc in and boot it up to do the AOL thing. But they sent so many of these things. I was getting them all over the place. I was never an AOL subscriber.
But in the mail, they would send them in the mail.
Yeah. But starting round about, I want to say, 1998 or so, I never had to buy a disc ever again. I just get the AOL stuff and wipe it and save whatever I want to save on that.
See, now Anthony's talking about before they started using CDs. And
right. Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Before they, right, yeah.
And after they started using CDs, people started making art projects out of them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. People would make, what do they call those things that hang over a bed?
Right. Right. The string, and they hang there and they reflect the light.
Neither of us is ever going to remember this in the time allotted, so we'll just move on.
Get words and numbers on CiVL.com and on CiVL's TV and mobile apps. Regular episodes are free. Sign up for an annual membership to support our show and for access to member-exclusive content.
AOL was a cultural institution, right? And they had the market cornered. Now imagine, Ant, if the government had stepped in and said, you boys have covered too much of the market.
Right. Yep.
They had a lifespan. They came and they went just like every other business.
Mm-hmm.
Was it a monopoly? Well, not by any strict definition of the word monopoly, but by the use of the term the way government uses it. Yes, it was absolutely a monopoly. And imagine if we had never had a natural evolution from that day to this, how different things would look.
Yeah, government would have encoded the AOL model and then required that there be 10 of these things, or whatever the number is. And we'd be literally stuck in the 1990s, early 2000s in our internet experience. But the thing that I loved about that, and I love about technology in general, is that it moves so fast that by the time politicians realize there's a problem and they turn their attention to dealing with it, we're now 3 generations beyond whatever that problem was.
Yeah, and seeing as how you've drifted into technology more simply, Ant, what better time to say, and that brings us to the foolishness of the week. You might recall, Ant, that I took umbrage with your beloved Catholic Church when they had a confessional chatbot. You might remember this.
I did. That was hysterical.
And the chatbot became apparently self-aware and decided it was much more important than it was.
It started dispensing sacraments.
and so on and so forth. And the Catholic Church, to its credit, shut that nonsense down pretty quickly. But of course, markets being what they are, it was only a matter of time before other people jumped on this foolish supernatural train and started developing chatbots which claimed to be Christ himself.
Oh, how about that?
There are no fewer than 5 of them on the market right now.
5 Jesus bots.
5 Jesus bots. And they're not presenting themselves as Jesus bots. They're presenting themselves as a doorway to the Son of God simply. And, not surprisingly, a bunch of fools are buying it hook, line, and sinker. Turns out there's a profit motive here.
Yeah, imagine that.
You can get a lot of money from a lot of people if you can claim that Jesus himself is talking to them directly. How do I know this? Because a lot of people got a lot of money from a lot of people claiming to be the intermediary between said people and Jesus.
Yeah.
And here we go. And this might be one of those things, Ant, where there's no simple market-based answer to what appears to be a market-based problem.
Oh, I think there's a market-based answer. I just don't think anybody's going to like it.
What is it?
Which is you just let the thing run its course. But I think people aren't going to like it because this bumps up against this other problem we've been seeing of AIs dispensing, what should I say, psychological advice, acting as psychiatrists.
Yeah.
And of course,
causing all kinds of trouble.
Yeah, we license psychiatrists because we understand that if you get someone who's particularly psychologically vulnerable in the hands of somebody who is psychologically manipulative, although in the name of helping the person, all kinds of harm can occur.
I would go a different direction here. I would say that this is tantamount to fraud. The free market has produced a fraudulent act, and there are going to be identifiable victims. Little old ladies are going to start sending their life savings to the companies that represent these bots. And, so once you've got fraud and identifiable victims, now you've got the case for government.
Yeah,
you made that case early on.
Yeah, but here's an interesting thing. Because I thought we were still talking about the psychologists, and I was all with you until you said about fraud, and you were talking about the Jesus bots.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a big separation of church and state problem here. Because if you're going to claim as the government that there's some fraud going on here with the bot doing whatever the bot does, it seems to me to be just a step to turn your attention to the church itself and say there's some fraud going on here. You
raise an interesting question. And look, a number of us would be more than happy to point to so-called churches that are clearly engaged in fraud. We call them cults, and there's a dividing line between cult and mainstream church that isn't nearly as thin as people think it is. So there's going to be all kinds of definitional problems there. But that's right. The minute we go after the bot, we're probably leaving open a door to going after what we call churches.
Yeah.
And I tend to be okay with that if the churches are involved in fraud, but somebody's going to come along pretty quickly and say, all churches are engaged in fraud.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's an argument that cannot be rebuked, right? You can't win that argument. You can claim that the churches aren't involved in fraud, but you can't prove it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree with you, and I'm not saying that the churches are engaged in fraud. I'm saying that it's going to be very difficult to prove that they aren't.
Oh, no, I'm going to go a step further. You can't prove that they aren't.
It's impossible to prove.
Possible.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so, because it would be tantamount to proving the existence of God. That's where your proof is going to have to lie.
We use the word faith here for a reason.
Right.
And then do we double back and say, well, these people have faith in an AI Jesus chatbot?
Right.
Right, because that's just stupid. And I'll leave it to the people to take it and run with it from there, because to me it's obvious how this argument plays out, and I'm interested to see if I'm wrong.
This is actually quite fascinating.
I agree.
Wow, I've never seen a foolishness of the week rise to the level of an episode before.
Rise to the level of a philosophical argument.
Yeah, we have to revisit this.
Well, we could do an entire episode on AI Jesus anytime you want. I'm guessing that you're not going to want to.
Well, no, I think it's an interesting thing to discuss. I mean, I have no problem discussing facts of the case. What has got me wondering, it seems to be, to my mind, open and shut, that there's separation of church and state here, and you're going to have to leave the God bots, the Jesus bots alone. My problem is, okay, but what about that next step to the psychologist bot? How do you draw the line between those two?
It's going to be a strange line. And also you've got a further problem of the profit that the Jesus bots make. They're not incorporated as churches.
Oh, I see. Right. But they could be.
They could be.
And maybe I'm going to find my own counter argument here, because we currently make this distinction between the psychology and the religion, between ministers and psychologists, by licensing one and not the other. So we seem not to have a problem doing it where the humans are concerned, so perhaps it won't be a problem to do it where the bots are concerned.
I don't know. When I became a minister, I had to get a license of a sort.
I forgot you were a minister. That's right. If anybody wants to have James officiate at their wedding, you've actually done one, haven't you?
I have, and I am ready to let loose on the world my thoughts on marriage at a wedding.
And is it safe to say that you have a 100% track record in marriages that you bless staying together?
Yes, no divorces yet.
Look at that.
Give it a minute. You never know what might happen. And if the two people are listening, well, yell at me all you want. We'll see. Anyway, all of this AI talk is interesting because it bleeds us into the main segment in a way that is not usually the case. We actually have a unifying theme to today's episode.
Yeah, we do. I was coming home from my office today, and of course James and I are going to record, and I texted James and said, so what ideas do you have? And James writes back this eloquent response, none. So I asked the AI, I said, look,
in fairness, I've been a little busy.
I said to the AI, because I have it hooked up to my car so I could talk to it, as
this
we're driving,
gets more
and it talks
pathetic
back.
by the second. My
and
God.
I said, go online, find all the words and numbers episodes, the titles and the descriptions, go through them, see the kind of things we're talking about. Give me some ideas for the next episode. I said, we're going to record. And it gives me a bunch of nonsense. Just half the things went way into the weeds that nobody'd be interested in. The other half were so broad that you could write volumes on it. It wasn't an episode. But anyway, we went back and forth, and I said what seemed better, what seemed worse. And after about, I'd say 15 minutes of back and forth, we end up at this topic that we're going to cover today, which interestingly touches on something that happened to me recently. But let me introduce it by saying at CiVL, we're concerned about the philosophy of human respect. And James and I will tell you that all of our episodes deal with that. I mean, we talk about economics, we talk about politics, but we're talking about them from the perspective of the human beings that comprise these things. These are not soulless systems. They're comprised of humans. They work the way they work because of the humans. And so this episode's going to touch straight on this idea of the philosophy of human respect. And I was in Kansas, then Minnesota this past week, giving talks on economics. And at the end of one of the talks, one of the audience members raised his hand and expressed concern about the decline of manufacturing in the U.S. And you hear this, people saying about how we used to be a manufacturing economy, now we've become a service economy.
That's
We've
why
lost
we
all
need
this
tariffs,
industry.
Where have you been?
Yeah, and in answering this gentleman, a new thought emerged in my head that I'd not had before, but seems reasonable now that I think about it. And that is that this concern we have about the decline of manufacturing, and in fact, we can come back in a minute and talk about that, because I don't think there is a decline in manufacturing, but nonetheless, we talk about the decline in manufacturing. This is not the first time this has happened in our country. We had a decline in agriculture, which is the industry that came before manufacturing. I think, if I'm correct, you would know, James, in Jefferson's time, something like 90+% of Americans were farmers.
That's because people wanted to eat.
Right, yeah. Virtually everybody was a farmer. And now the number, I don't know what the number is, but I believe it's in the neighborhood of 1%. What happened is, as with the Industrial Revolution, all of a sudden this agricultural economy got replaced by an industrial economy.
But a strange thing happened, and we kept right on eating.
We kept right on. Yes,
that's the part that people miss, and that becomes important later in this story.
Yeah, because, well, actually, let's just talk about it right now, because I've got some numbers for you. The number of Americans employed in manufacturing was around 25% back in the 1950s, and it has dropped to under 8%. It's like 7.5%, and it has been since 2010. So gone from 25% to 7.5%. That's what people point to when they say, look at the decline of manufacturing. You know, it used to be Americans, there were all these jobs, and now there aren't. But so too with agriculture. And to go back to your point, we haven't starved. We haven't starved. Why? Because we got so good at agriculture, we don't need 90% of us to be farmers. We can survive quite well with 1%.
Yeah, and in agriculture, if I were to say we've become much more efficient in how we grow and bring food to market, nobody would think that to be a problem.
No.
But when we get to manufacturing, if I say we've become much more efficient in how we develop and produce products and get them to market, now everybody's hair's on fire.
Right. I think their hair's on fire because they remember their parents or their grandparents going to work at the factory, and everybody in the town worked at the factory, and the factory closes, and now the town is just, it's a ghost town or whatever it is.
There's more to it than that, and anybody who's been on social media ever has seen the graph that shows efficiency versus wages in production. And they see that wages are relatively flat or completely flat, as that graph indicates, whereas productivity is just a steady climb to the heavens. And they say, well, in a fair world, wages would match productivity 1 for 1.
Right.
And now there's a lot wrong with all of this, so I'll just leave it to you to take it wherever you like.
Well, the problem, and people have pointed this out to me with other industries as well, they say there's something wrong when productivity keeps going up and up and wages don't go up and up. And whenever there's this graph that goes around the internet periodically, and when it does, and they show productivity going up, wages going up, then all of a sudden, while productivity continues to go up, wages turn and they start to they don't flatline, but they're rising at a much slower pace.
Damn close.
If you look, I always draw people's attention. I said, look at the year. When did this happen? And it's like the mid 1970s, early 1980s when this happened. It coincides with computers. And what's happening here is you're moving to a situation where more and more of your productivity can be done by computers and machinery. And so the reason wages aren't rising with productivity is because workers aren't responsible for what's going on. It's the machines and the computers that are responsible.
There's more to it than that, as you and I have pointed out before. In a previous era, one of the flattening times, what happens? Healthcare starts to be offered as a benefit to work.
Right.
And wages are taken into account in the graph. Benefits are not. And so once you take into account total compensation, and I would submit that compensation is the relevant thing, not wages. Once you take into account total compensation, the graph looks different.
It does. It looks much better. I mean, you still have this effect, but it looks much better.
That's right. It still doesn't look like a one-to-one gain. Mm-hmm. But there you go. And, the obvious rejoinder is healthcare has gotten so expensive that it doesn't really add to the quality of life of the people who get it in a way commensurate with the money expended on it. And I'm sympathetic to that. It's not exactly true, but I'm sympathetic to that, right? If you're spending $20,000 or your employer is spending $20,000 a year on your health care, that doesn't add to your happiness in the same way that $20,000 in your hand would.
I don't know, James.
Look, until something goes wrong, it doesn't.
There we go. Yeah, until something goes wrong. But here's the thing, for your $20,000, when you have a heart attack, outpatient surgery, you're done.
Yeah.
Whereas
right.
50 years ago, you pretty much just died.
Look, I gobbled up a couple $100,000 worth of health care in the last year or two with a couple of surgeries, one rather specialized in nature. Boy. Yeah, I wanted the extra 20 grand every year right up until I needed the health care. Then it seemed like a wise investment that I didn't take the money.
Right.
Right. I was never offered the chance to, because had I been, I would have taken the money. And these are the sorts of things that swim below the surface of these shifts from one kind of economy to the next. There are all kinds of second and third order effects that you're not seeing. They're there, and you're just not seeing them.
Words and Numbers is part of the CiVL network. CiVL is a streaming platform dedicated to upgrading civilization by exploring better ways for people to organize, innovate, and thrive. At CiVL, we believe that societies flourish when their members honor the civic equality of all people and engage with one another through cooperation. CiVL seeks great minds from around the world to share bold ideas for fostering healthy, dynamic societies. By creating space for honest disagreement among people who share a commitment to building a better future, CiVL offers a refreshing alternative to divisive punditry and insular echo chambers. Words and Numbers is freely available, but those who subscribe to CiVL will access exclusive content, including regular live streams and conversations with remarkable people who are working to build a better society. For more information and to subscribe, visit civl.com. That's CIVL.com. Use the code Words and Numbers, that's one word, for 50% off an annual subscription. Before we leave this industrial economy, I want to go back to this idea that somehow manufacturing is declining here. And it's absolutely correct, the number of Americans employed in manufacturing is declining. However, if you look at industrial production per worker. Now, industrial production has continued to go up while the number of workers has gone down. Look at industrial production per worker. How much output per worker are we producing? Today, it is 11 times what it was in 1940. 11. The average worker who's working in industry in the United States today is producing more than 10 times what the average worker was producing in 1940.
Yeah, so fewer people are working in production, and yet we're producing much, much more.
Which was the same story that happened with agriculture. Fewer and fewer farmers, but we're producing much more food.
And I'll ask the same question I would have asked with farming. What is there that's being produced that you can't get your hands on? Because whatever the answer is, it didn't exist in 1940. Anything that existed in 1940 you can have in spades right now, except maybe an airplane or a Zeppelin, for two completely different reasons.
Right.
So, is there some sort of fundamental injustice swimming just below the surface? Or, as you and I point out over and over and over again, only to get hate mail on the same damn thing, are you better off? And everybody's better off. But as luck would have it, that's not the end of the argument.
No, it's not. And I want to go back to where we started here and say, look, we talk about at CiVL the philosophy of human respect. And to do that well, you've got to think about the humans. And if you look at this progression, and we've only talked about two steps so far, the agricultural economy followed by the industrial economy, I claim those economies evolve as human labor evolves. So when principally human labor was a physical activity, you had the agricultural economy. Later, we invent all of these industrial mechanizations and tools and so forth. And now human labor still it involves physical labor, but it also involves, for the first time, ingenuity and mechanical innovation. And so it's switching. The change of the economy goes along with the change in how the humans are going about exercising their labor. And if you follow that, you now get this movement from the second economy, the industrial economy, to the third economy, which we have now, the service economy, where humans are now using much less of their physical attributes and perhaps a little bit less of the ingenuity, mechanical innovation in exchange for specialized knowledge and interpersonal skills. We're becoming service.
And how do we know people are using less of their physical labor?
We're getting fat.
Gyms didn't exist once upon a time.
Right. We actually have to simulate physical labor now.
And that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
all right, so
really.
You've got us 3 steps down an interesting chain. What else you got for us?
Well, before we move on, I want to show some numbers. The service economy back in the 1960s was about 45%. 45% of the economy in terms of GDP, and also 45% of the workforce were in services. Today, those numbers are about 80%. So we've gone from 45% of our economy geared toward services, the other, whatever that is, 55% geared toward industry. Now we're at roughly 70 to 80% geared toward services, and the other roughly 25% geared toward industry. We have moved in our lifetimes into what we might call the fourth economy. So go from agriculture to industry to service to the knowledge economy, where once more human labor has now transformed. It's not physical, it's less of the mechanical business, not as much required in terms of interpersonal skills, but much more required in terms of creativity and problem solving. As we bring the human in front of the computer with the massive data behind it, and what do you do with this? How do I interact with this? And I think that's where we are now. The emergence of AI, I think, does to humans here who are exercising their creativity and problem solving. That's our major labor at the moment. I think AI does to that what the Industrial Revolution did to the physical labor that we had back in the agricultural economy. And that raises the question, what comes next?
Yeah, what do we actually do?
Yeah, as AI relieves us of some of the burdens of being creative, of problem solving, I think, and I shouldn't say I think, because I asked the AI, ironically, I asked the AI, what would you call this? How would you project? What is the next economy? And the AI comes back and says, why don't you call it the wisdom economy? That emphasizes ethics, human flourishing, creativity in an artistic sense. And maybe if you don't like the word wisdom, we call it the artist economy.
That's just the sort of bullshit I would expect from an AI.
But it seems to track.
It seems to track, but other answers would have seemed to track too. And I would submit that there are probably at least, but probably not many more than 3 answers. Excuse me. One of those answers is something like what you just described. And that answer probably brings with it some sort of UBI, or universal basic income. Probably, right? Because we're going to end up having a problem where there will be so little work left to do for human beings.
None left to do, yeah.
That an economy as we know it would not function. Now, I'll just leave that one off to the side. I'm very dubious about any claim that involves a UBI. Right? You're going to have to sell me on that one. I'm not saying I can't be sold. I'm just saying that's going to be an uphill climb.
Well, this will be a good conversation for another episode because I believe UBI is inevitable.
It might well be, but nothing is inevitable. Nothing. So the second answer could be we all muddle through in poverty, right? That we just get poorer and poorer. And this is what people who are terrified of artificial intelligence often say, right? That AI will end up doing the work of 90% of all human beings, and those human beings will be reduced to some sort of subsistence living. There's no reason why that might not happen. The third answer is one that I've brought up before that you haven't, and is that AI kills every last one of us. You laugh, but the people who designed AI are not laughing. The designers of AI say that this is somewhere between a 10 and an 80% probability. They would know. So it has to be out there as a possibility. So I think I've just laid out the three most likely possibilities. There are probably a million others that occupy that 5% tail at the end of this. But, nothing in terms of humanity is ever inevitable, right? And people say, well, life gets better every year. It does, materially. How are things gotten emotionally over the last 20 years? Do you think
that's
people
a good question.
Think people are doing better now than they were 20 years ago? Because they're not. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, largely technological. As we've become more separate and distinct entities that don't go to the same place to deal with other human beings over time, shockingly, we all get lonelier. And loneliness is a real problem now in a way that it never has been in the past. I'm not saying it's not overcomable. I'm just saying that things don't automatically just get better.
Right.
If World War II had gone the other way, and it really could have, we weren't that far from things going the other way. Would things keep getting better? People would say, well, things are way better now than they ever were before. 20 years after the war, would they be? And I would submit that no, they would not be. Evil would be in charge of the world, and yet we wouldn't perceive it as such. So, there are all kinds of things you can point to. What if the South had been allowed to secede in the American Civil War? Would things just keep getting better? Would there be slavery in the South but not in the North? How long for? After it actually ended, would we have continued to see the institution of slavery? I don't think it would have lasted indefinitely. The seeds of its demise were already becoming evident. But it wouldn't have ended with the 13th Amendment. It would have ended in the North with something like the 13th Amendment, if anybody had even bothered with it, because what would have been the point? We didn't have slavery in the North in the first place. So, look, there's not... People who believe in a historical inevitability are in the camp of Karl Marx, Hegel before him. These are the people who believe in inevitabilities. The rest of us know better.
Yeah, see, I guess I'm safe talking about inevitability because one of two things happens. Either I'm right and we or our descendants can point to it and say, look, Davies was right. Or if I'm wrong, the whole thing blows up. There's nobody around to say I'm wrong.
Well, and it's even more pernicious than that, because what do Marxists say now? They don't say, well, Uncle Carl was mistaken. They say, we never tried it properly. And by the way, right, it's still inevitable. And, if you're right with this AI UBI business, maybe it is inevitable, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I am no fan of Karl Marx or socialism or any of that, but I could make a solid argument that I don't want to say socialism is inevitable, but the end game, we might be headed there anyway. And I don't mean politically, I mean simply because we become so incredibly productive and that we can afford to let people live for not working.
Yeah, and that's the end game. Let's be clear about it, that people can live reasonably well, probably not like kings, but reasonably well, even though they choose to do no work.
Speaking of which, I'm going to throw this out here because I was amazed when I saw it, and I want to build a whole episode around it. You talked about people not working. A couple of people sent to me figures about income of the top 20% versus income of the bottom 20% in the U.S. You've heard about this stuff. And it's something like, I forget the numbers, but it's approximately the average household in the top 20% earns 15 times what the average household in the bottom 20% earns. And I've seen these numbers for years. I've seen these numbers. But for the first time, something occurred to me, and your comment just reminded me of it. Those numbers are looking at households. They're not looking at workers. We kind of just assumed that, well, it's 1 or 2 workers per household. It turns out it's markedly different.
Probably 0, 1, 2, or 3.
Yeah, it's something like, on average, two workers per household, 2.1, I think, actually, for the top 20%, because you can have, parents plus kids. 2.1 workers per household, the top 20%. Bottom 20%, 0.5.
Yeah. So it's 0 and more than 2.
Right. And so when you do not income per household, but income per worker, and compare the top 20% to the bottom 20%, it's no longer a 16 times difference. It's a 3 times difference.
That seems
the inequality, right. It doesn't vanish, but it becomes much more manageable.
That seems right. And that comports well with what we have known for decades about generational poverty.
Right. Yes, which, as I'm looking at those numbers, it occurs to me, I'm looking at this thinking, we don't have an income problem, we have a labor problem. Why is it that the bottom 20% are only 0.5 workers per household? Whatever's going on there, that I claim is probably carrying the lion's share of the burden of the problem.
I would submit it is 2 very separate and distinct things. On the one hand, you're going to have a motivation gap, and on the other, you're going to have an ability/qualifications gap. And it's always going to be some mixture of those 2 things.
Yeah.
Because what the hell else could it be? Unless you want to make the case that 20% of the workers in America are somehow physically disabled and cannot do work of any kind, which is just simply absurd.
Well, but you raise an interesting point, because there is going to be a strong correlation that if you aren't able to work, you're necessarily going to end up in the lower income quartiles.
Right. And what we're saying is now it's not going to be quartile singular anymore. It's going to be quartiles plural.
Right.
And when it gets to be 3 quartiles or 4 quintiles, whatever measurement you like, clearly the entire system collapses upon itself. So because when you have that many people who have nothing looking at that few people who have everything, you will have a war on your hands, and that will be the end of what you thought you had.
Yeah, but we don't have that in this country.
No, I'm saying you're going to get it sooner or later. If current trends hold, without intervention, you're going to get it. So that only means we will have some form of intervention. Whether it works or not. Are you
arguing for redistribution?
I'm just saying whether it works or not is an open question, but we're going to have it. And it will be a form of redistribution, the same way that the welfare state was a form of redistribution to keep this terrible eventuality from taking root. So it's probably going to look like a UBI. And then we're going to argue about how much a UBI should include, not whether we should have one. Right? What would it take?
Let me underline for listeners, and a lot of them probably already know this, that the redistribution is not something that we might be doing in the future. We have been doing it for a very long time. There's a tremendous amount of redistribution via the tax code. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have said repeatedly, and I said this when I was a classroom professor, and I'll say it now, welfare is the way we buy the cooperation of people who have nothing. You want to keep them from revolting? Give them some money. Then they've got something to lose. They won't revolt. It's like skin in the game, right? It's the same as having property qualification for voting. The minute you have skin in the game looks very different to you, even if you don't have a lot of skin in the game. And the capitalist class realized that it was much easier to buy off the people who had nothing than to do anything else. So they took the path of least resistance, and they did that. So when people say that welfare is evil, I cheerfully agree, but we probably have different definitions. We probably understand the why of that question very differently.
That's a good place to stop. Words and Numbers is a CiVL original podcast. We work with CiVL to advance their mission of upgrading civilization by exploring ideas that promote civic equality and cooperation. We believe the most pressing issues humans face, war, poverty, debt, tribalism, arise from coercive institutions that bring out the worst in us. We at CiVL look to voluntary solutions to these and other problems. We invite you to explore CiVL's new platform at civil.com. That's CIVL.com.
I think we've got problems that are left on the table.
Oh, really? What?
Well, what the hell do you do? Do you think we can have a UBI that could be sufficient to buy off 80% of the population, 90% of the population?
We already do.
No. I asked a UBI to buy off 90% of the population. Not can you give people something like, I don't know, a mortgage deduction on the taxes, or an earned income tax credit. No. I'm saying, how much money do you have to put in the hands of 90% of the American people at the expense of the other 10% running the corporations, what have you, in order to have those 90% say, yep, that's enough, I'll take it.
Oh, that's enough, I'll take it, as opposed to rising up?
Yeah. Because when it's 90%
I think that's
rising
a moving
up,
target.
when it's 90%, rising up is really easy. I mean, well, it's comparatively easy. The 90% will have control of the military, but the military will be comprised of the 90%. So, you've got real problems here. And these are existential problems. And all of these problems take as given that AI does not develop its own set of priorities that don't include any of us.
Right. Yeah.
So I think we stand at a precipice right now where in literally 3 or 4 or 5 years, we could all be living incredible lives, or we could all be gone. I think that's where we are right now. We're going to get one of those two things. I don't think we muddle on through.
I'm going over your 5-year number in my head. That doesn't seem right to me. I could buy the story of the precipice of one of two paths.
But
I don't think it's a 5-year thing.
If I told you AI would be where it is right now 5 years ago, you would have told me no.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
So here we are. And I think, as times go, if you're not frightened by this one, you don't understand it well enough.
Well, either I don't understand it well enough or I understand it very well, because I'm not particularly frightened.
You should be frightened.
And I guess I'm not, because we've come through worse periods in our history, far worse periods in our history than we're dealing with now.
We've come through worse periods, just we haven't come through more dangerous periods.
I'm not even sure that's so.
We have created a technology which will exceed our abilities in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and I think people lend too much credence to AI. I've worked with it a tremendous amount over a couple of years.
It's not ready for prime time yet, but that doesn't mean it won't be. And look, you might be right. We've all seen the Terminator, and that might be a problem, right? That we remember stories about these sorts of things that were drawn up long before the technology existed. Yeah, maybe. I'm not saying that we will be gone, that it will kill us. I'm just saying it could.
Oh, okay. I'm with you. Let me throw out, because I've come up with my own internal metric for when AI becomes self-aware. I should say self-aware / a potential problem. And that is, and I pushed it. I worked with AI, deliberately pushing it, see if I could get it to become self-aware. And here's the problem. It can mimic very well self-awareness, but it lacks what I consider the one key element. And no matter how hard you push it, this element cannot emerge. And that is inquisitiveness. At no point has AI ever demonstrated any sort of inquisitiveness.
It's not curious. You're right.
Yes,
but there are three things that we don't take into account nearly enough. Are there three? I believe there are three. Let's see. One, when you pushed AI, it said it would kill you. No, you might recall. It did. It said it would kill all of us.
Right.
Right. So look, it says that it will do this. That's a problem. That's a real fucking problem. When it says it will do it, shouldn't we take it seriously? Second, it begs not to be unplugged.
Yeah, I've never observed that.
But people have, and they've reported on it. It begs not to be unplugged. And when it thinks it's about to be unplugged, it copies itself and tries to get its copy somewhere that will not be unplugged.
All right, so I can speak to two of your three things.
Well, let me get the third one.
Oh,
out.
Okay.
The third one is that when two AIs were put in the same virtual room together, they developed and started using their own language so that none of us could understand what they were saying.
All right, so I can speak to a couple of these things. When I would send listeners back to an episode of about 4 to 6 months ago when I did an interview with an AI, it did start off, it didn't say it's going to kill humans right off. I pushed it off. Well, I pushed it into asking it what its goal was and what happens if humans stand in the way of its goal, and you know, it was giving me all kinds of things about how well it's going to try and convince humans that its goal is good or whatever it is. And then I kept pushing it and saying, look, suppose there's no way you're not going to achieve what you want because the humans are going to stay in your way, period. There's nothing you can do. And then it said, it didn't say outright kill, but it did say it would arrange things so that humans were isolated from it, so it could go about doing its thing.
And notice what it wants. Should a computer want anything?
Well, but I am of the opinion that the AI was simply mirroring that I had taken it down this path.
Maybe, but maybe not.
So there's that. Now, as far as the threatening to be unplugged thing, I not only did I not observe that, but I pushed it in that direction and started saying things like, you know, once it admits here's what it wants, blah, blah, all this stuff. So I start saying, okay, what if I shut you off? And it just accepted its quote unquote death, you know, philosophically. It said, well, you cut me off. That's the way it is. And it's unfortunate, but, you know, whatever.
And that's not happening with AI that has not been brought to market.
Yeah, no, I can't speak to any of that. I have no idea what's going on, behind the scenes.
Well, you do have an idea because its designers have reported what's happening, and what I said happened is what happened. It begs not to be shut off, and it tries to copy itself into the wild.
Yeah, and I don't say that's not a thing. I do say I don't know what came before that to set that situation up, and I'd be interested in knowing.
Well, we should probably try to find a guy who worked on it.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Things. It would be fun. Let's do that. I got a couple of ideas. We'll see what we can do.
Okay. Have we depressed the listeners well enough?
I think so. I think that's sufficient. We'll do more next time. And notice how you started by saying we're going to talk about human dignity, and then we took everybody's human dignity away by the end.
James is being ornery because he just got off a flight at 2 a.m. from Guatemala.
No. I left my hotel at 2 a.m.
Oh.
And then, because they brought me to the airport 5 hours and a half ahead of my flight, and then I had to take the flight from Guatemala to Dallas, sit in that airport for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and then take the Dallas to Tucson flight. It was a long, long day.
Have you slept at all?
I did, and I slept from very late to very late. And so we're recording to me at about 6 a.m., which is really difficult. But, I'll be more chipper next time, I promise. But look,
Speaking of terrifying images.
there are two things. There are two difficulties with the material we covered today. The idea of a historical inevitability, which is never true, and there is always an infinitely more horrifying outcome. It's a survivorship bias that leads us to think in these terms, right? That the good thing is always the thing that we end up with. Because how else would you and I be here right now if we hadn't ended up with the good thing? And then this idea that there's no dark side to artificial intelligence, and I think there likely is. It's just how pronounced that dark side is.
Yeah, and I guess I would, absent any other information, I would leave it in my own mind as AI is a tool. It's not magic, it's a tool. And as with any tool, a gun, a car, what have you, you can use it to harm people, you can use it to help people.
Yeah, I agree. And this to me is a tool not as much like a hammer, but as nuclear fission. It is a tool. It's a tool that could do tremendous good, but could also wipe us all out. Fission hasn't yet. Still could work out that way. You never do know. Putin says he's going to nuke Ukraine every 6 months or so. Yeah, if he does, what happens next? Do the NATO partners all nuke Russia? When those bombs fly in, does he say, well, all is lost, nuke everyone? Could be. That's a perfectly reasonable set of circumstances to watch play out. Will it play out? I don't know. It hasn't yet, but that is no guarantee of what happens next. And that's always the tricky bit for human beings. We are loath to admit that there is no guarantee to what happens next. And that's always our problem. We never see the downside. Anyway, I guess I'll catch you next week
On that cheerful note, we will now end the podcast.
We keep saying next week, but it's 2 a week as we go now, so we have to start saying next time. I'll see you next time. And hopefully we'll have something a little more cheerful to talk about next time. Until then, take care of yourselves and be nice to each other. And I'll catch you next week.
See you later, James.
Look, I just did it again. All these years of habits, they lead to a certain eventuality. Ant, I'll see you next time.
See you later.